juncture in a chasm and carves out an opportunity for hope. The empowerment of emptiness, the gift of pain, the legacy of loneliness, the pricelessness of pain, the strength of suffering. Without wounds, would we have warriors? Apart from anxiety, is there a desire to rest? When we perceive the purpose of the pain, we will hold on to hope, having the understanding that strength only comes through suffering. Tonight, I'm talking about the gift of suffering, the pricelessness of being broken. And this topic gets me so excited, and one of the reasons is because this is something that God has really been teaching me lately, and He's really changed my view of my own suffering and what suffering is. And the other reason is that I was sharing this with some people, and the responses I got were, the gift of what? What are you talking about? And then someone was like, how is suffering a gift? Suffering comes from sin. And normally, I'd be like, oh yeah, that was stupid. I was wrong. But this time I was like, but this is right. Like, I can prove it. And so it got me really excited because maybe you've never thought of suffering this way before. And so maybe this is an opportunity for me to present to you a different perspective. And you don't have to take that perspective, but just consider it. So, I've got a question for you. How many of you have taken a math class ever? Well, that's good. I know.
It all makes sense.
So, when you go to school, you don't just like start doing math yourself. You're not just like, okay, I'm gonna add 2 plus 2, and now I'm gonna multiply. You know what? I really want to try out geometry. And you know, I think I can do some calculus. Like, we're not just born knowing how to do math. And it's the same with the Christian life. We're not just born knowing how to live a Christian life.
Preach it, girl.
But a lot of times we treat it like we know what we're doing. We're like, I have a relationship with Christ that I've structured. I pray for what I need. I read my Bible. I try to be like Christ. But this is the problem. We can't be like Christ. We have to learn. We have to be taught how to be like Christ. And in order to learn, we have to have a teacher. So Christianity, being a Christian, is being a student under Christ. If you're taking notes, write that down. Being a Christian is being a student under Christ. How does that change your view of our relationship with Christ? Like, I'm a student. I'm not doing this alone. God's got me. He's here to guide and direct and teach me. It's the difference between saying, excuse me, Mr. President, what's your thoughts on this? And crying out, Dad, would you help me? I think we forget that we have a loving Heavenly Father who wants so badly to give us wisdom and carry us through, and that same Father is the King over everything. So being a Christian is being a student under Christ, being taught how to live. And how are we taught? Through refinement. And how does refinement happen? Through brokenness. And a lot of times, there are 3 different reactions to suffering. There's fight, flight, and freeze. So, the person who's like, the fight one, they're like, bring it on, bring on suffering. We're gonna do this. And then the person who's like flight, they're like, suffering, I'm out. Like, no. And then there's the person who's just like, suffering, I'm paralyzed. But the great thing is, no matter what your reaction to suffering is, this applies to you. Because because of one thing, and that is hope. Suffering leads to hope. Write that down. Suffering leads to hope. Okay, so now we have an object lesson. Okay, so you know the pessimist, optimist saying of a glass half full and a glass half empty? That's good enough. Okay, so what if the optimist is right? So I got this cup, and it's half full. I'm doing pretty good. See, God, I think I'm doing pretty good. I mean, my life's not perfect. Like, my glass isn't full. But it's half full. It's better than empty. Like, you know, I think I'm doing pretty good. I'm holding it together. Well, maybe that isn't the greatest perspective. Like, God, look at what I'm doing. Okay, so what if the pessimist is right? I got this cup, and it's half empty. God, would you just, like, fill this for me? Like, God, my cup is half empty, and I've kept it from being any lower, so couldn't you just, like, fill it? Couldn't you just, like, help me out here? What? You want to pour out my half-empty cup? It's not even full. Do you know how hard I had to work to keep this from being empty? Yeah, well, that's not really any better. Okay, so what if neither of them are right? What if the person who's right is just the person who just wants more water? The person who just wants more Jesus. I have this cup, and God, would you just pour it out? God, would you just break my cup? Because I just want more water. I just want more you. And you're like, but pour out my half-empty cup? What are you talking about? And I'm like, this half-empty cup of polluted water that I filled it with? And I'm just like, hey God, would you just like fill the top here for me? Thanks. Well, now you're having God pour his clean water into my polluted mess? That doesn't really seem any better. So I'm like, okay, fine, God, I'll dump it out. I worked so hard for that, but who even cares? And he's like, oh, you need to give me the cup too. And I'm like, whoa, the cup too? And he's like, but there's dirt in the bottom. And it's cracked. And it still smells from when someone soaked their dirty socks in it.
Oh.
And I'm like, but it's my special pink cup. I'm not getting rid of it. And he's like, but my clean water's gonna like mix with the dirt and like spill out the crack and taste like dirty socks. You wanna drink that? It's still polluted. And he's offering you a new, clean, full cup of water. This is exactly what Paul is talking about in Philippians 3:8. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. God, take my cup, pour out my water. I just want more you.
Amen.
And so this is where we come to the first place on this journey through suffering, and that is surrender. And this part of the journey is so important because you can't go forward until you have surrendered your suffering. Nothing else that I say is going to make sense, is going to matter unless you begin here. So write this down. Suffering without surrender is useless. Suffering without surrender is useless. And that is because suffering itself is not a gift. But because of what God does through your suffering, it is. So, am I saying that God can't use your suffering if you don't surrender it? No. I believe that God can and will use anything. But can I just say, you are going to make it so much harder on yourself. And that is because, and I'm going to quote Charles Stanley. That is because our resistance to God's breaking process prolongs it. Our willingness to yield early shortens it. This is the only area of the breaking process that we can impact. We don't choose the targets, dictate the circumstances, or choose the tools. But we can determine how intense the pressure will build and how long the process will continue by our willingness to yield to God. And when we're unwilling to surrender, God has to chisel a little deeper and sand a little stronger. Charles Stanley also says, some people I know talk to God about these areas and even admit that they are refusing to yield control of them to God. But they still don't let go. They rationalize their behavior by saying, nobody's perfect. Or they tell God that since they've been dealing with this area of their life for so long, they're about to conclude that you must have made me this way, God. The reality is they don't want to submit this area of their life to God. See, our natural tendency when God begins to target an area for breaking is to cling to that area even more. Because generally speaking, we know what it is that we're supposed to submit to God. And that was convicting to me. Like, we know what, God's trying to, take away. And we're like, but God, I want that. And a lot of times when we see someone suffering, we have this misconception that they did something wrong, or that God's trying to teach them something. But we really need to be careful because there are two forms of suffering. Just suffering when we did mess up and we are suffering the natural consequences of our sins, but there's also unjust suffering, where it isn't some sin and its consequence. We didn't do anything wrong. The Bible talks about this with Job and with the blind man in John 9. And we need to be careful about judging people because of their suffering. Just like we need to be careful about judging people anytime. But, so if you want to dive a little deeper into this, I have a few resources. So this book by Timothy Keller called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, Pastor Chris recommended it to me, and it is amazing. It really dives deep into things. It's really good. I really recommend it. And then if this topic at all interests you, this book, The Blessing of Brokenness by Charles Stanley, was really amazing too. And it's not super deep, not deep. It's not super philosophical, so if you're afraid of I'm not gonna understand it, no, this is perfect. And then also if you're well, I don't feel like I'm really suffering, but I feel like I'm carrying a burden. I heard a speaker this summer who talked on going from burden to blessing and walking through the Psalms. And he has a podcast, and I can send it to you. So if you want to take pictures of the books or find the podcast, just talk to me. So yeah. Okay. So now I want us to take a moment. And if there's some suffering that you've been going through or a burden that you've been carrying, begin to surrender it to God, because the purpose of suffering begins to break through when you surrender it. So, just close your eyes and surrender it. come back. So now we need to ask the question, what is the purpose of suffering? I mean, that's a pretty good question. If we're suffering, we should ask, why am I going through this? And I'm going to give you 5 points if you want to write them down. So the purpose of suffering is, 1, meeting God the deliverer and learning to rely on him. Meeting God the deliverer and learning to rely on him. 2, being drawn close to Christ. Being drawn close to Christ. 3, hope. Suffering leads to hope. 4, refinement. 5, I can't, but God can. So the first point is meeting God the deliverer and learning to rely on him. And I read 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 10, and I was like, I have to share this. So it says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we are experiencing in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again." Can I just say that that basically sums up all the points? But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. So here we see that God is a deliverer. And we see that suffering leads to hope because we trust that he will deliver us again. And suffering takes us to a place where we realize that we can't do it, but God can. So God is a deliverer, and suffering teaches us to rely on him. And suffering opens up a wonderful opportunity to draw us so close to Christ. It shoves us out of our comfort zone and knocks us on the head, and we're like, oh, I need Christ. And that is a beautiful thing. When we come to this realization, like, I need Christ so badly every day. And suffering leads to hope. Hope is wholeness. The purpose in the breaking that happens in suffering is the putting back together. The purpose of suffering is the wholeness at the end. And that is what we must understand. Brokenness can be a path towards great blessing, but only when we allow God to do the breaking and to design the putting back together. Because if we are broken and we just put ourselves back together, we're still where we were before. And refinement. The purpose of suffering is refinement. When we surrender our suffering to God, he uses it to shape us to be more like him. If we truly want to be all who God designed us to be and all that God desires for us to be, we must submit to him during times of brokenness and allow him to reveal to us why we are going through what it is that we are experiencing and what he desires for us to learn from the situation. And the last point, which was, I can't, but God can. This brings it back to surrender. The purpose of suffering is to bring us to the place where we say, God, I can't do this. But God can. And this is what God has been teaching me. Because my cup was in shattered pieces. And normally I would have been like, oh, no, it's okay. God, I can do this. I got it. But this time, it was so shattered that there was literally no way in the world that I could put it back together. And I realized, God, I can't do this. And he was like, that's what my wide open arms are for. I had to stop trying to get out of the pain and start letting him carry me through it. Suffering brings us to the place where we are so shattered that we realize that we can't pick up the pieces. And we have to surrender our suffering, let God pick up the pieces, and let God give us a new cup. So write this down. Suffering is a gift when we let God carry us through it. Suffering is a gift when we let God carry us through it. Now you may still be asking, okay, that kind of makes sense, but I'm still not seeing how suffering is a gift. Well, Philippians 1:29 says, for it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. So the word granted comes from the word charis, if I'm saying that right, which is the idea of grace, and it means to give someone something out of love. So the verse says, so it has been given to you out of love that you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. And this word is the same word that Paul uses in Romans 8:32. When he says, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Paul uses this word not only to describe God giving us his son, but also to describe God allowing us to suffer. So suffering is a gift because God has given it to us as one. And so whether or not you agree with me that suffering is a gift, suffering leads to hope. And I have a bunch of verses. So these go along with my 5 points. So there are a ton of verses of God's presence being with you during suffering and during trials, and then God the deliverer, God can, suffering and hope, refinement, and is suffering a good thing? So yeah, you can take a picture. All right, and that is what I wanted to share.